Welcome to the Women in Transport podcast. I'm your host, Shireen Ali Khan, and this is season 2, where we are covering everything intersectionality. We're looking at the layers that make us who we are. We're looking at privilege, looking at oppression, and really what makes us human. Welcome to the latest episode of the Women in Transport podcast. I'm your host, Shireen Ali Khan, and today I'm joined by two amazing women. I've enjoyed all the conversations we've had so far, and so I'm really just amazed we're in the space we can record the session today and share all of those insights with yourselves, our listeners. So I'm joined by Kai-Nneka Townsend and Sharon Pickering. I'm not going to overly introduce them, but today's episode is really focused on the fundamentals of human performance, which is all of what this is about. It's about helping people to be their best selves and to perform in a way that's comfortable for them, in a way that they can as well. So Kai-Nneka, I'm going to come to you first to introduce yourself, and then I'll hand over to Sharon.
Thank you, Shireen. So I am Kai-Nneka Townsend, a leadership resilience and burnout consultant. And what that means is that I teach leaders and their teams how to build resilient skills and so reduce the risk of burnout. And that's all about being able to manage stress. And that came about because, unfortunately, I experienced burnout in a workplace years ago. And even as I moved away from that space, and I started to work across international development, health, and other sectors, I saw a pattern that reminded me of my own experiences, where leaders were exhibited symptoms of burnout, but somehow were either not acknowledging it themselves or didn't even recognize what they were going through. And so for me, it was just so important to start to center this whole matter of how do we support leaders that they are bought into the whole matter of looking after their own selves so that they in turn can build that culture and know what it means to be able to look after their own team. So I'm really excited to be able to talk about this and other topics in today's episode.
Great. Thank you so much, Kai-Nneka. And I really love the fact that you have that kind of cross-sector understanding as the Sharon actually. It's really great to be able to bring all of that into transport in its widest sense. But I really love the fact that you have that top-down approach on like, how do we empower the leaders to then look after their workforces and really genuinely embed that learning into a workspace. So thank you. Really excited to have you today. And Sharon, to you.
Thanks, Shireen. It's really a pleasure to be on this podcast with you today and also to be sharing this space with Kai-Nneka. I know that we have a lot of mutual connections there in our mission. So Sharon Pickering, I'm a human factors professional, and I've had the pleasure of working internationally across research and commercial settings, primarily in safety critical industries. So most of my work has been centered on aviation and healthcare. And my main focus really is to work with high risk professionals in high stress situations, but actually I do span the full range of professionals in that space. So my real core focus here is all of the human elements. So it's bringing the physiological, the cognitive psychology and emotional elements into play, because often when we address human factors, it's very much here's people, here's their limitations, here's their capabilities, and we're going to design some equipment and the environment and the job that they perform around the job that they perform. But there's also a more holistic approach to human factors. So it's really important for me that we focus on the individuals and their needs and their wants around what happens outside of the workplace so that we can optimize their human performance in the workplace. So I'm really excited to share these experiences with you all today and have this mutual conversation.
Great, thank you. And Kai-Nneka, I know you mentioned some of the burnout that you had yourself as well. I'd love to learn just around what was the staging around that? What was the context of that?
So for me, I would refer to what was happening as a cycle of burnout. There were a few years where I went through periods of what felt like, okay, stress. This is a few weeks, going to a few months, it's going to stop. I go on vacation, I come back, and I'm like, yes, I'm ready to go again. And inevitably, I would find myself in longer and longer periods of stress. So there was a lot of work. There were long hours going on. There was, unfortunately, some toxicity in the workplace as well in terms of relationships. And so all of those things combined were leading me to a point that made me feel extremely exhausted. So my energy was depleted. I started to feel detached from work. I was like, what's the point any way of doing this. And in some ways, I was even questioning my own efficacy. Like, is this really, do I really have the ability to continue to be able to do this work? And so getting to that point repeatedly, it did come to one point where I was like, something has to change.
Yeah.
And so that was my experience. And I think when I got to that point, the change for me at that point was really to take a step away from the workplace, out of work, to do some reflection and some kind of self-direction to say, what do I need to be doing different? And I ended up starting a different career path.
Wow, thank you. And Sharon, what was your route into human factors? Because it wasn't a planned route, was it?
No, it wasn't a planned route at all. I actually started out from the age of 15 training to be a fighter pilot. So I was in the Air Training Corps in the UK. Life mission really was to join the Royal Air Force and be a pilot with them for the duration. At the same time, I was doing a psychology course at my local college. And one of the modules was human error. And they handed me one of the first accident reports from 1976. And recalling the content of that report when I was reading it for the first time still brings chills to my spine, because it really was a pivotal moment in me deciding that prevention and human factors was really the key to success in aviation. So I decided to dedicate my career then not to be one of the really cool pilots, but to be the person on the ground trying to save the pilots so that they could save other people. So I then went on to research in human factors. So I went into the scientific realm, looking at accident reports, looking at human error as a label, which there's still, it's advanced quite a lot over the last few decades. And we have a lot more awareness that when we use that label now, there's a lot more contributory factors and content. However, that label is still used. And for me, I think that label does need addressing. So I actually went into flight deck design. So had a great time of my life, really, just working around the world at all the major aircraft manufacturers, integrating human factors concepts into the design of the flight deck. So I got to work with all of the people that had the ideas, all of the engineers that had the technical competencies, and then the pilots that were on the receiving end of having to fly. And even that for me was just an incredible emotional journey, because I got to really engage with all the thinkers behind the scenes in aerospace, and then also appreciate that from a pilot perspective, because I've been sort of semi there in the training realm. So yeah, it was a life-changing moment really, and I'll say that quite candidly, in that it was really became a life purpose to support those that are serving and supporting others in high-risk industries.
That's massive. It's a really big realization to have at any point in your career, and it sounds like the two of you have it's life experience, isn't it? That's what I'm getting at. You've had lived experience, you've had life experience, and then you've understood your role in there is somewhere else. And I think you've mentioned it before around human factors. You mentioned human error, and we're talking about helping humans. So what does that look like for the two of you? Kai-Nneka, I'll come to you first. What does actually helping people look like to you, and what does it mean in practical terms?
One of the things that I discovered as I spoke about earlier about my own experience of burnout and leaving that particular role and moving across to different sectors in international development and health, I really started to see a pattern whereby, especially as we were going through change cycles, a lot of leaders were expected to carry the weight, as you would expect, of looking after their teams. But there was a gap. Who was looking after the leaders? And so there is something about the ability to empower leaders whereby they're bought into that concept of being able to look after themselves, what that means, and therefore in turn be able to look after their teams. So for me, helping the leaders is where we start, because they set the culture and the tone for their teams. So if they're bought into it, they understand the importance of what it means to build their resilience, how to manage stress. It means that they in turn can spot the needs in their own teams of where there are gaps, where is it that there are changes in their team members that says, hang a second, something is wrong, something might need to change, have those conversations. But for me, it starts with them. So it's about equipping them to be able to help themselves, and also for them to be able to help their teams. And so that's what my work looks like.
And how do you do that?
So I do that in two parts. One, it always starts with an assessment. So it's really about understanding where are the leaders from a resilience point of view. And there are 5 factors that I look at. Where then they're in terms of their mental strength, their emotional intelligence, their physical stamina, their social support, and their sense of purpose. So it starts with that 5-point assessment. And then from there, we use that data to be able to build really customized resilience programs. So that could be in the form of workshops, it could be in the form of coaching that allows the whole discussion about, okay, this is what we are seeing in terms of where there are gaps. How then can we help you to be able to fill those gaps? So sometimes they're very simple things. You could start with the whole matter of where they're physically. So a lot of the reports show that where leaders might have a strong sense of purpose, very often they're not really high where the physical stamina is concerned because they're not getting enough sleep. Why? They might be working long hours. So that's where we start to get to what's the root cause. We start to have those conversations that says, what's the root of this? And very often when you start to look at the details and having those discussions, it might be something systematic where there is work overload. So that could look like there's too much work focused in a particular area, or that work is not distributed, or there might just be something else that's not quite right in the setup of work in that environment. So for me, once we have looked at that assessment, we start now to get to what is the root cause that's allowing these persons not to feel as resilient and end up feeling quite stressed in the work environment.
Excellent. I will come back to you, I think, both around the topic of root cause. I think there's going to be interesting in both areas there. But Sharon, I'll come to you. How do you help people? How do you help humans?
Yeah, sure. I think I just want to add on to what Kai-Nneka was saying about leadership. So, I mean, we've all been in personal experience where we've either been leaders or we've been led. And we were talking about this just the other day, that well-being and resilience as labels are semi-misunderstood, and identifying what that means for individuals and then for corporations and then organizational culture is still a kind of gray zone. So we were definitely addressing that when a leader sets or a company sets values in terms of a statement around well-being, the leaders then have to lead by example. But I believe that's also from my experience, observing people across the world and also being part of those environments, that there's actually a component that might be missing. It's negotiation. So we've got individual needs from a well-being perspective to be able to build resilience, but an organization also has their own needs to keep the organization running, optimized and sustainable. So I don't think we've quite addressed the negotiation point of the demand between a company's needs and an employee's needs, and how we can better, not necessarily balance, but optimize that relationship so that we can essentially meet everybody's needs to survive. So what I do in human factors, I mostly focus on all of those human elements that I mentioned in the introduction, the physiological, the cognitive, but now I'm really heavily focusing on the emotional, because it's something I've brought in from psychology, and it's always been there embedded in human factors, but not necessarily a main focus or a balanced focus with the other components. So I will make sure that everything I do is related to the holistic combination of those elements in any assessment. So I spend a lot of time working on communication. Sometimes communication is a downfall. It's one thing to have, so I'll give you an example. One of the countries I worked in, CEO had to set a wellness allowance for the employees because that was mandated by the country. In turn, the CEO also had extreme demands for high performance in an extremely stressful working environment. It was a startup environment, so there's extenuating circumstances around the success of that. So there is differences that we need to account for in human factors, whether it's an established organization versus a startup. And when we talk about building resilience, essentially that became a little more like a tick box exercise where the wellness allowance was allocated, but then there was no actual, in a financial setting, but then there was no actual time for the employees to use the wellness allowance within a year, because so many pressures were set on the milestones and the deliverables of the project to get to the next phase of funding. So again, coming back to negotiation, I think it's a key component that we should be addressing, because it's not necessarily we tick that wellness box and everybody will be well. They'll do their yoga sessions, they'll do some, a golf lesson, for example. It's actually balancing more the scales of how the humans in the system works in an organization from a cultural perspective.
Sharon, if I may, I really liked this whole matter of negotiation. And I think my experience in engaging various corporations is that sometimes there is that fear that the balance is being tipped to say that it's about the organization giving a carte blanche to employees now to be free and do whatever they want, and then productivity and profitability goes through the door. So I really like that whole matter of negotiation. And what for me, my thoughts around that is, the reality is not, there is going to be some amount of stress in businesses. And for some businesses, in fact, there are going to be periods of intensity. So how then can we balance or allow that mix, that where there are periods of intensity, there is that clear expectation. So going back to that negotiation, there's that clear expectation, that during this period, we need to be able to work at this level. It might mean working longer hours, but then coming out of that, what is done differently to then allow these same employees to be able to use times where it's not as intense, to be a little bit more flexible at whatever that will look like, or whatever other needs that the employee would have. So I really think that that whole matter of negotiation is important. And it might be unique, it might look different to each organization, but there is that element of how can we optimize, as you say, what we have here. So if there's a period of intensity, there's a clear expectation, look, we're going to need to be running this project. It might require longer hours. So everybody's on board, but then equally knowing that if the employees know that beyond that period, there will be a point to recharge and do something different, then that is also helpful. And I think is a way of negotiating well, using your term. So I really like that term.
Absolutely. And I think just because we are talking about the fundamentals of humans here, from a psychological perspective, it's setting expectations and perceptions. As individuals, we all show up to work with different expectations and perceptions that are not necessarily communicated. So I know from your perspective, Kai-Nneka, that you take this approach as well. It's a preventative approach. So we look at the education and we set the guidance, but then that's not enough. We then have to work on the integration. But then we have to package that around a pragmatic preventative approach, because if we don't do that, essentially, we can dream up on paper the most desirable situation, and well-being can be a very generic term, but actually it's a very personal experience and need. So we have to be very pragmatic about what we're setting on paper in terms of policies or values versus what we're actually implementing in practice. And again, just coming back to the realities of the demands of a situation and how we can effectively adapt, especially within the transport industry. I mean, we're talking about women in transport here. So often we don't have necessarily a choice to relax, for want of a better word, and let things just unfold. There's a demand. There's a demand to the public. There's a demand to the people that we're serving in transport. So we often don't get that luxury to have the remote working. So it's not necessarily an option for most of the people working in transport. And they have to show up and decide how they can best address, are they well enough to do the job that day versus do I even have an option to reschedule? Where's my safety community within my organization where I can raise that as a concern and I can actually press pause? And I think in the transport industry, it's probably more relevant as we've experienced. There often isn't a pause button that people can press where they can say, can we just have this conversation? Can we communicate the negotiated needs and then move forward? Because it is quite fast paced and it is quite critical in terms of a demand. So I think that's quite an interesting aspect.
I love all of that, and you've naturally taken me through my questions, which has been brilliant. You're both the perfect guests to have on the podcast, because I absolutely wanted to touch upon that, the sector specific, but also because we've had some quite good advice around negotiation and the ebbs and flows of projects and understanding the context of an organization. What advice do you give to people in actually being able to articulate their needs? Because when you're in the situation where you're not feeling great, or you might be on the verge of something, like how best can a person empower themselves to help themselves out of that situation?
I like the question. I think it's honestly a very tricky one. The reality is that very often there are patterns of work that you will begin to notice. And so my advice is that the individual in that situation do that own self-reflection and assessment to see where are they, what is happening, and what are their specific needs. So think about specifically what is happening, what's the impact, and what is it that they want as a result of this conversation that they'll be having with the line manager. And then it's about communication, so choosing the right time and place. So I mentioned about knowing the patterns ahead of time, because perhaps in that very moment, unless it is that genuinely, look, I'm sick, I'm out, I can't do this, you might not want to choose that moment to be the moment to be saying, I need to change the way that we're working, etc. So if it's more generic like that, I would say choose the right time and place to then have that conversation with the line manager. And then thirdly, I would say really come from a solution-oriented position. So coming into that discussion to one, offer solutions to say, this is what I see happening, this is the impact, and here's what I'm suggesting as an alternative. But also be open to the discussion, using that term earlier, negotiation, because it is very much so about the employee well-being, but also about the business's ability to continue to do the work that it needs to do.
Definitely, yeah. So, I mean, I've been through personal experiences myself where I've needed support, but my younger self didn't know how to ask for that, especially, to be quite honest, at the time in a very male-dominated environment as a young female engineer, working in human factors, which at the time also was not necessarily as highly regarded as an engineering principle. So there's definitely been times where I've had personal experiences or female-specific health needs where I needed some space, I needed some support, but I didn't know at the time how to ask for that. And I think from my personal experience, that did come with building confidence, and that's quite an individual skill to acquire in your profession, because we show up, I mean, even as experienced professionals, we show up and there's still an element of fear of failure, fear of judgment, and fear of a stigma of a label that may not be recoverable. So I think we have to be quite delicate when we're talking about how people present themselves. But there is certainly, we've talked about it in the past amongst the three of us, an element of personal accountability and responsibility as well. We can't just expect corporations to have all the answers for us, to treat us in cotton wool. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, I just mean that in kind of like the caring, representative way. But as an individual, we have to be accountable for knowing what we specifically need, what works for us, what doesn't work for us, and how we might need to be adaptable in that space. But it has to be recognized and acknowledged so that we can make that sustainable. Because at the end of the day, I think Kai-Nneka and I have spoke about her personal experience, which I'm sure she can go into in much more detail, where there was a solution to burnout, but it was a very temporary solution. So we have to look for more sustainable methods of how we can continually adapt together. So for me, it's about personal accountability and responsibility, as well as expectations from a corporation to be able to do everything that you needed to do from a personal perspective. But in turn, learning all the time. So for me, growing in my career, I was very lucky. I had male and female mentors that were very trusted, confident. So I was able to discuss these factors and work through them sort of behind the scenes before I found my path to being able to vocalize them to my leadership team. And then when I became a leader myself, there was a lot to learn then from the flip side, because a leader has so many demands. You're kind of, depending on middle management, for example, you're sandwiched between the middle, where you're getting the pressures from the milestones and the deliverables from an upper scale, but then you've also got the demands from your team needing your attention, needing your time, and trying to find that balance as a middle manager was extremely difficult for me personally. And I did lean on my mentors quite heavily in that growth period to understand what had they been through. And I got the male and female perspective because I also didn't want it to be necessarily highly emotive. I needed more pragmatic tools. So for me, I built a toolbox over time where I was able to bring out different sort of tools to meet the certain circumstances.
Love that. Thank you. Kai-Nneka, do you want to come back in?
I did. And, Sharon, I love the very personalized, personal way in which you kind of opened that part of the conversation and sharing. And it made me think back to some, conversations I've had with other individuals, other women. And sometimes the reality is that whole matter of the confidence might not be there. And so one of the other avenues that we can think about is where they exist. Sometimes they're network, staff networks within a company. And that is another space or avenue where there is the opportunity to kind of share what are some of the concerns that can be then collectively shared back in terms of line management and company. Because the reality is there's not always that kind of boldness or that feeling that there is, a psychological safety that you can speak up for yourself about, what's going on. So, sometimes there are other avenues that we might want to use, and that could be one of them.
Definitely. And we're linking all of the concepts that we're already very familiar with, but we're linking them really nicely, because the psychological safety is beyond just being able to ask for help and support. It's actually them being acknowledged and supported. And then there's a whole feedback realm around that cycle, that it cannot just stop at we've fixed the solution, therefore there are no other problems. I think kind of you've said in the past to me, like, getting to the root cause is the real fundamental aspect of this. So rather than we've called it band-aids in the past of, just fixing a solution in a temporary sense, coming full circle. It's like accident investigation. How do we get to the root cause to be able to prevent future events of similar kinds happen? We'll never be able to fix everything, but we can certainly start chipping away at the fundamentals.
Hello, I'm Sonia Byers, Chief Exec of Women in Transport, and you're listening to the Women in Transport podcast. I'm proud of the work we're doing together to create a safe space for different women working in transport to share their stories. You can find details on how to join the conversation in the episode show notes.
What are the most critical health and safety issues facing workers within transport and infrastructure? So, because we've spoken around like root cause, but actually I'd like to know what some of those issues can be for frontliners. And you can absolutely bring in some of your insights from other sectors, whether it's healthcare or other frontline areas. But what are the most critical health and safety issues facing workers in transport and infrastructure?
I'm thinking about that from two perspectives. When you mention the critical needs in terms of health and safety for frontline workers. So if I think of my experience in transport, where I started out working on the gate line, and if we move away from the infrastructure of thinking about the possibility of trains and the impact with that and interaction with that, it has to do with the interaction with the public, so customer service. So a lot of what was faced then was that interaction with how the public responds to us as workers in transport, especially when they think that they have been wrong. They might have the wrong ticket and someone is speaking to them, etc. And so it can cause a point of conflict. So that is definitely one of the areas that was of high concern and quite challenging to manage. Some of the ways that I know that was dealt with was there was training on conflict management. How do you deal with conflict? There were things put in place to be able to easily report where you've had that difficulty in interacting with a member of the public. One of the things that I thought that could have been done a little bit better is that matter of care and concern from the managers. What do I mean by that? So there is a way in which managers can do what they should be doing according to company policy. So the report comes in, you investigate it, etc. But sometimes, very often, what you would find is that workers felt like, and you hear them say, the managers don't care. They don't. There was this perception that the managers didn't. Let me frame it that way. There was a perception that the managers didn't care, and that in turn left employees feeling like, why am I having? Yes, you're being paid for the job, but why am I having to put up with all of this? Etc. And so I think going back to our earlier point about those human factors, the emotional state for them really was important, but didn't seem as if it was being looked after. And that could have been different, because in turn, it means that their behaviors towards the public would be different, sometimes coming off as aggressive. This company doesn't seem to care about me. Why should I care about the interactions that I have with the public? So that was definitely, from a transport experience, one of the things that was of high concern at that point of conflict, possible conflict with the public. Sharon, I don't know what your experience.
Yeah, no, they're very valid, very relevant points, and it's something that I think we don't often get an opportunity to really reflect on. So it's just as you were talking, Kai-Nneka, I was going back to my experiences across aviation. So I've worked with airlines, I've worked with manufacturers, I've worked with training departments, and pretty much all the support infrastructure. And I was trying to think, we've often looked at aviation as the transport industry as the gold standard. But even today, I work with teams. They still have fundamental human performance issues. They still have conflict in team dynamics. They still have communication issues. And I think what's being talked about more these days is a critical need around how vulnerable they feel. And I think as workers now, there is a lot more noise around, are we safe in our work environment? There's been COVID, there's been financial, economic issues. And I think now people are starting to worry that that's all going to become unstuck for them. And I think when we look at how people can show up and start to communicate their needs, we also have to take into account that from a human psychological perspective, we all do feel vulnerable in very different settings. And that's really relevant in the transport industry because they are on demand and they really have to be seen as high performers. And I'll just give you an example from a pilot perspective. I know pilots all over the world, and they've all got very different approaches. An American pilot compared to a pilot in Dubai will have a very different approach to how they communicate their emotions. So now overlaid on that is the newfound term mental health in aviation. Now, I say newfound term, it's always been there, but we've not really been that vocal about what that means for the people involved and how they're able to be perceived as this high performer. So I work a lot now with teams on trying to understand that term high performance and try to also get them to understand that it's not a sustainable marker that they need to continually achieve. It's more about safe and sustainable performance. So for me, it's optimized performance. And I think there's a lot more that we could do around that. So it's beyond just fixing that in training. It's beyond just fixing that in literature that we can communicate, I think we have to go right back to the hiring process, right back to the licensing, where we now bring these psychological human elements into play. It's no longer now just a square box that's sitting on the side. We actually have to make that really integrated into the competencies that are required for the job that the individuals are being hired for.
Excellent. There's so much in there. My follow-up question is, how would you encourage line managers, individuals to take that individualized approach with their staff? And it's really easy if you're a good communicator, or if you had training in leadership, or have been, have the right role models around you. But often in our sectors, people grow into the roles because that's naturally where hierarchy takes you. And so what advice would you just give to people in taking that individualized approach with their people in turn?
So I think at the start, and just a very human factor here, is to have a genuine interest in knowing your people. And that's a good place to start. I think where we go into perhaps the more technical, or developing the skill around being able to do that, there are different kind of psychometric tests. So there is the DISC or Insights. There are programs that can help you to identify who you are as an individual and who your team is, who your team are as individuals as well. And you could use that information to help to guide. So it becomes a guide and not an instruction manual, but a guide to say, actually, this might be my preferred style of communication. This might be my preferred style of managing. But how do I then adapt that based on the preferred style within my teams? And equally, the clear expectation from those individuals that they might have a preferred style, what being able to adapt to their colleagues, and also being able to adapt according to the situation to their manager. So for me, the first thing, as a human, have the genuine interest. And then the second thing is, there are systems, psychometric tests, etc., or assessments that can help you to equip you with understanding yourself, understanding your team, and so you're better able to adapt to the needs. And equally, it becomes that mutual relationship, isn't it? Where they also can understand how can they better adapt to you as a leader in particular situations, so you can achieve the purpose of delivering the objectives of the team.
I love that. So being able to understand people around you and having that real human approach, but ultimately it comes from understanding how you present yourself as a human and being curious about the other people around you as human beings. It really is just the fundamentals of being a member of this species, isn't it? Just being curious, being kind, knowing how you present yourself. How do those around you present yourself? I think that's a really amazing takeaway, and a real first step. Like, if you're not doing that already, then be curious around the people around you. It's one of the points of the podcast, actually, is to showcase all that lived experience, that it's impossible for one person to have an understanding of all that lived experience, but by sharing these stories we can absolutely get to the point where we've got that intellect to hand. And what great way than to meet all the amazing people that are on our podcast. Sharon, what advice would you give to people to really have that approach?
Yeah, that definitely resonated with me. It's been a long journey of discovery for me to figure out how to communicate these concepts to people. People often say it's scientific. How do I put that into practice? So I'll take it right back to the basic fundamental. Just learn to breathe first, because often people forget that part, and that sounds a little bit unusual because we do breathe autonomously. But sometimes if we're in a high stress situation, people will often forget that if we just breathe first and just take a few seconds, that can often alleviate some of the stresses that we're feeling. So that's definitely something that I instill in every conversation that I have as a fundamental human principle. Don't forget to breathe. Then I think as a leader, what I've experienced personally as a leader, and what I'm now working with with high-performing professionals, surgeons, pilots, is figure out what works for them. So it's a very individualized recipe. So I think in doing that reflection and then building your own recipe as an individual, that helps you appreciate that it's not quite a simple solution, and there isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach to this. So doing that activity yourself definitely resonates with what Kai-Nneka was saying. But then also really engage with the team, get them to do the exercise that you've just performed, and then have that constant feedback loop. It's one of the biggest advocacies of my career is feedback, feedback, feedback. Without it, we cannot learn. Without it, we cannot improve. And without it, we actually don't know what's working and what's not working. So in human factors, the traditional approach has always been, how do we fix what's not working? But now what's coming through finally is looking at what does work and how we amplify that and do more of it. And that is really something that takes a team. It shouldn't fall on the shoulders of one individual, because a leader can't necessarily create that supportive environment that takes care of the team members without understanding what it is that the team are needing. So the team also needs to take responsibility to be vocal.
Yeah, I really love that. Do either of you have good examples where organizations have taken your learning on board, have implemented your strategies to achieve success? I'd love to hear some of that. I think our listeners would really enjoy that.
So I was recently working with a Coast Guard. It's the first time actually I've worked with the Coast Guard. I've worked with all kinds of transport teams. So I wasn't quite sure what to expect. We started to talk about feedback. And it was quite interesting that we all, as a team, they all had different understandings of feedback. So even in a highly critical functioning team that knew each other very well, they worked with each other for 4-day straight shifts. They knew each other's families. When we talked about feedback in terms of the principle and the practice, we really had to get down to the finite details of what we meant by feedback. And that it was really quite fascinating for me, because one of the female commanders, she, outside of work, she was a cheerleader. She was part of a cheerleading squad, but she was also a cheerleading coach for a younger team. And she had this moment of incredible excitement where she realized that she could actually implement these formalized practice in her work setting and use them in a out of work setting. And she said, well, we should be doing this in cheerleading. So for me, that was it was eye-opening from my perspective, being the one doing the education around feedback, in that she'd made this connection, and she went away from the day and she created her own checklist so that she could hand it out to the team and she could explain to them what feedback was, so that they built more formalized styles of communication and in a slightly more pleasant, informal way. So she really, really took that on board and just ran with it. And then she reported back to me like a week later and said, you won't believe it, my daughter's team went and won gold.
Oh, wow.
So I'm not going to take credit for any part of my feedback at all being the winning streak. But I certainly think that, when individuals embrace the concepts, but bearing in mind, I had a full day with them where I was able to have the time and the luxury. So I give the credit to the management team for allowing all of the operational team to be present that day. Now that's a big deal, because I think now people don't necessarily have that luxury of time. We have the formalized training room, but the extracurricular additions where you're able to sit down together and have the luxury of a day is quite few and far between. And I think we were only able to do that because it was the Coast Guard. I'm not sure necessarily in other transport settings we would have the luxury to have the whole team together.
Yeah, it's a really good point that you raised around all of that, around the adaptability of tools, because they are to do with people, and the fact that you can take them to other sectors and other settings, because it is about humans doing human things just in different ways. But also, as you say, around just enabling your team to work with experts, to learn, to grow. We've mentioned about innovation today and the constant need to evolve and to innovate in order to be more productive, but also taking it back to really base terms of just being a person and what do humans need to be productive. But absolutely, one of the things that I always say is, don't repeat the wheel, don't kind of reinvent the wheel. When you've got experts doing stuff, bring the experts in to short track you to success, rather than going through the same learning, the same mistakes. Because if there's a saying that says success leaves clues. If you've got someone who can bring you those clues, then why would you not work with them? And this is a really good example of working with people, but enabling your colleagues to have that space in a genuine way, not just today's the day we're going to do wellness, but tomorrow I'll be back in at 8 o'clock in the morning, shift starts, because you're not going to enable them to then practice those things. So it's all of that, isn't it? It's the space, it's the time, it's the option to practice, it's the curiosity, the space to breathe. I think it's all of that, isn't it, to achieve success?
Yeah, and there was another key element. It was rather than me going in as an expert from related industries, telling them how to do their job, I actually gave them the floor. I said, this is your day. I'm here to facilitate and guide you. We created a panel so that they got to have a conversation about what feedback meant to them. I got them to do a task where they collaborated with their colleagues in a different way. And I think that sort of stuff is quite unique nowadays, rather than going in and saying, here's a tool and this is going to solve all your problems. That adaptability comes with ownership as well. It was really great for them to build their own way of working that met the job that they know best. I don't know the ins and outs of their jobs. In fact, I hadn't even gone to the realms of observing them, which is what I would normally do. But I made the conscious decision in this setting to not have any preconceived biases on how they work, to really, really allow them to tell me, this is what we need. How do we mold those human factors tools and apply them to our specific needs?
I really love that. I've just over the last period or so started working with a lot of organizations who use lean, and it reminds me kind of similarly of that collaborative planning, which is we don't get to success unless we all are part of the solution. And so I really like that. Yeah, absolutely enabling people to have the space to share their grievances or where they see that the problems being, but then working collectively to have that solution. I think that's a brilliant way. Kai-Nneka, is there anything you'd like to jump in with?
Yes, I love that whole matter of the adaptability. And I'll swing it into an example of a client I was working with, a leader who, for them, they came into the coaching situation thinking things are out of control, things are beyond my control, and there's all of this, work to get done for myself and the team I'm leading. And what was interesting is that as we began to unpack the situation, what came out is that they were able to identify that they had more control that they realized, including the fact that there was a working culture of working long hours, even when it wasn't necessary, because it was seen as, if I work these hours, it demonstrates just how dedicated I am and how good I am as a worker. And so people were almost trying to outdo each other. And they literally said, had that reflection piece that said, I don't have to work those hours. And here is what I can be doing. And here is the space I can allow for my team to have that kind of flexibility as well, to say, as long as we're meeting those goals, then you can work according to the hours, and not everybody being required to stay here until 6, 7 p.m. because it's kind of expected. And so, going back to that whole matter of the leadership, the leader setting the tone, what was really brilliant for me is to see that light that kind of flicked on for them in terms of, I have more control than I realize over this situation, but then also being able to extend that to the team and empower their team to have that sense of control and not having to stick to, the culture. So really question the status quo of the culture that says we have to work these hours or else we would be seen as not necessarily performing or doing that work. And that for me was just so brilliant to see, because that was one of the roots causes of the kind of chronic stress that was happening in that space. And just linking back to this whole matter of adaptability, one of the things we spoke about for that is the understanding that there is a need to be able to be flexible, going back to negotiation. So there are periods for that team where they just have to work long. We get that. But then the leader was able to say, but no, what we can do is pre that period and after the period, we can allow some downtime and flexibility so that the team gets a chance to recuperate and be ready for the next period of intense working. And that for me was success. I was like, great. Questioning the status quo, being able to work in a way that delivers the work, but it doesn't compromise the well-being of the leader or their team.
Yeah, I love that. What great takeaways. Thank you so much for both of my guests. I think this topic, there is clearly loads more that we could talk about. We've clearly only just scratched the surface. My thoughts are buzzing actually around where to take this next. I've got a few things I've been kind of writing down as we've been speaking, but that sense of control, the understanding where the culture fits into it. I love the top-down approach as well as the kind of middle and outwards and bottom and up, and really it kind of emphasizes that actually it's everyone and everything, and everyone should be part of that solution. That sense of collaboration, the negotiation, that's a key thing that I've taken away with actually is, what does negotiation look like? What's my role in that negotiation? And therefore empowering you. Negotiation and control, I think, go really hand in hand. We said earlier on around patterns and actually starting to understand what are patterns within myself as well as those around me, but having that external reflection piece, but also that self-reflection, just constantly reflecting on yourself. Am I where I need to be? And also where are my people? Understanding your needs and being able to communicate those needs. That sense of adaptability, having sustainable methods, but also having that accountability and understanding where am I in that solution as well. So I really feel like there's a real I in there, and not just around like me being a victim of my surroundings, but actually I can also empower there. And then we touched upon this, but this comes up time and time again in all of our conversations, is really that power of networks and mentors and having good people around you. But I think through the reflection, if you don't have good people around you, then hopefully we can in turn be clued up to what that looks like as well. Because I think negative work environments can really just put a lens where that's just what work is. And the more you talk to people, the bigger the network, the stronger the mentors, you realize actually we can work in a safe way, safest in its widest sense, where we all go home feeling healthy and happy and physically safe and mentally safe to come back to another day to deliver really, really amazing things in whichever sector. So they're just a few of my takeaways, which are just shed loads there. Thank you so much to my guests for today. And I look forward to welcoming everyone back to the next episode of the Women in Transport podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.